Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another show over here on That's Comical. And of course, if you happen to be watching and it's a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. I'm actually very excited because I'm back together over at Andy's place. And of course, Andy and I always enjoy having these great conversations. Andy, great to see you as always.
Yeah, it's always good to do this. I'm glad we get to do it again in person. We just did our W. Maxwell Prince discussion, which if you haven't watched that, please go back and listen to it because we really care about the guy and does really great stuff. But yeah, the last time we got together and we talked about Robin, I think we had a really good conversation being able to be in person. So this is very cool.
Absolutely. And today we're going to be discussing a brand new must-be-read episode, and we're really excited for today's discussion. There's many reasons why we are choosing this specific discussion. One of the main reasons is because we seem to be very DC-centric over here on our channel. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just because of the fact that DC just has such iconic stories. But to be fair, so does Marvel. So we're going to be going into the Marvel universe, not the cinematic universe, but the cinematic universe has a lot to do with our discussion today. It's also because of the fact that this happens to be a very big year for Marvel. There's lots of great anniversaries being celebrated this year. Not only is it the 60th anniversary of Spider-Man, unbelievable, but it is also the 30th anniversary of a character that is the main focus of our discussion today. We're going to be doing a must-be-read discussion of probably one of the most memorable Marvel comic stories of the 1990s, and that is Maximum Carnage. And it's Carnage's 30th anniversary, which is pretty awesome. But also at the same time, Spider-Man is one of the hot elements in Marvel right now. Clearly, I'm hoping that most of you have already seen Spider-Man No Way Home, especially because of the fact that this week it is dropping on Blu-ray and DVD, which is wonderful. But also considering the fact that Carnage himself has actually shown up in one of the Sony Pictures Venom films, which is Venom Let There Be Carnage. Spider-Man is a character that is very, very relatable to so many people, but even though so many people love this character, very few people really dive into some of Spider-Man's main stories outside the death of Gwen Stacy. However, we will probably get to that story one day because the death of Gwen Stacy is extremely iconic. It's a revolutionary moment in comics. But anyway, everybody, before we get into this discussion, I just want to say we hope you enjoy the show. So please don't forget to leave a thumbs up as well as a comment. And there's more stuff on the way. So please do not forget to hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest content. So, Andy, I'm pretty certain that Carnage is a character that you've been very familiar with over the years, I'm sure?
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say, as some background here, I had read Maximum Carnage when I was younger, but hadn't read the story for a very long time. So I remembered it in broad strokes, obviously reread it for this. Find it a lot more memorable now. There was a lot more to dive into, which, we'll talk about today. But yeah, familiar with the character. I think that Carnage is, like Venom, a quintessential 90s character. And I think you know what I mean when I say that, right? I think there's elements to the character that worked with the kind of feeling of the time.
Yeah.
The way that he's presented in the pages. I mean, but the design of the character, the characterization of the character, it's a very, very 90s character. It's interesting that we're talking about the use of the character in current movies and how Carnage is being drawn on now, because when I think Carnage, I think 90s. And I think there's a lot of that in Maximum Carnage.
Yes, yes. And the other thing is, when you take a look at a story like Maximum Carnage, you've got to go just a couple of years back, because we go into the late 1980s, early 1990s, because Maximum Carnage came out, I believe, in 1992.
Sounds right. I think I saw 93. That might be the last issue, and that's why it's like the copyright date or something.
So before that, we have to remember where Marvel was, particularly Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man was one of the hottest comics on the planet. As a matter of fact, it wasn't as extremely popular as X-Men at the time, but it was really funny when you took a look at Spider-Man books and it said the most popular non-mutant character of Marvel Comics. But where am I going with this? So Spider-Man in the late 1980s was under the control of a man named Todd McFarlane. And Todd McFarlane, as we all know, when it comes to comic books, is one of the most well-known and most beloved comic book creator now today. He was not so known until Marvel tapped him to start drawing Spider-Man comics. And when he started creating his Spider-Man comics from an art perspective, before he was asked to write and draw a brand new Spider-Man comic that was made specifically just for him, he took Spider-Man to a new level. He drew him differently. He gave us poses that we never thought were autonomously what's the right
You're getting
word?
there. Anatomically. You got it. There
possible.
You go.
They were beautiful. Even though he was getting a lot of backlash from the Marvel higher-ups, and we all know what happened there, but that's not what we're discussing today. He decided to really do something with Spider-Man, go dark, which is something that hadn't really happened in the Spider-Man comics since the death of Gwen Stacy. Through that, in a story that went from Amazing Spider-Man 298 to Amazing Spider-Man 300, we were introduced to a character named Venom. Now, we already knew what the black costume was because that was where Spider-Man found it in Secret Wars issue number 8, and we saw what it was doing to him and his mind. And so he got rid of the symbiote, and it found a new host, and it became Venom through Eddie Brock, and Eddie Brock used the symbiote as a revenge for Peter Parker. That's basically what it was. The sales went through the roof. Trust me, you have no idea how valuable these pieces of McFarlane's work are right now. The most iconic cover is probably issue number 316. It's a beautiful cover. So iconic that Funko made a comic moment out of it, which I happen to proudly own. But all good things must come to an end. And even though Todd McFarlane did an amazing job on his own Spider-Man title, and we were also introduced to Eric Larson, who took over on Amazing Spider-Man after Todd McFarlane left that title, eventually they would both leave and they would go and create what is now known as Image Comics, and they're still there to this very day. And to this very day, Todd McFarlane is still making Spawn, and Eric Larson is still making the Savage Dragon. But Marvel Corporate still wanted Spider-Man to remain as hot as it was. So what did they do? They created a story where a piece of the symbiote that Eddie Brock was holding as Venom would find a new host, and it happened to be the host of a serial killer named Cletus Cassidy, and he would become Carnage. This was not Venom. This was not a character with a revenge story. This was just a character whose main objective was to create chaos and kill. So I don't think you could find the more embodiment of the 90s in a character like Carnage. And through this specific story, this was the way that Marvel was going to try and keep Spider-Man titles as hot as they were, because they knew they had just lost two amazing minds in McFarlane and Larson. But getting names like J.M. DeMatteis and Mark Bagley and Ron Lim to do some of the artwork, they put this big Spider-Man crossover story together in Maximum Carnage. And I personally think that, is it the greatest comic book story that I ever read? No, not necessarily. But what I will say is, it is one of those stories where I just had so much fun. It is a big story, but it's perfectly paced. It's got a ton of action. And I want to give this right over to Andy, because we were talking about this a little bit earlier today, and I really appreciated the way that you described this story.
So I have a feeling, I think I know which part specifically you might be talking about. So I'll just say my main takeaway in reading this is I find Maximum Carnage to be very cinematic. And I think that word has lost a lot of meaning. And I think people throw it around when they just mean like big story or big moments or crossovers. Or so when I say cinematic, I mean in reading this, it really feels like storyboarding something for screen. The dialogue feels like script writing to me more than comic writing. In a way, that's something from '92, you know, was not like commonplace. Like I feel like there's a tone in this that's really interesting that sits alongside more modern superhero comics, is the best way I know how to put it. And so even though they didn't have the pedigree of the MCU in the way that current comics do, and kind of think, okay, people are along for the ride, we'll do more of that kind of casual crossover stuff, more that higher level. There was something about this that feels, for lack of a better term, ahead of its time in the way that they chose to tell the story. That's how I feel about Maximum Carnage.
This story is exactly, I agree 100%. Now that I think about it, it feels very cinematic because like a movie, it starts out relatively small. And as the story progresses, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Like more heroes join in the fight, more villains join into the fight, higher stakes are happening, more dramas happening. There's a big climax, there's a great closeout.
And I'd say every frame, every panel, there's so much motion in this comic. And that's something that I think a lot about it, that I think is very fresh and makes it read as modern. And I think a lot of that is the Todd McFarlane influence, right?
I agree.
Because I mean, you see the legacy of what he brought to the character in how this story is told, 100%.
And this was also a great opportunity for Mateus and Bagley to really do something with their new character. I mean, he had a very strong introduction. I mean, I wish that I could have gotten the original floppies when they first came out, because that 3-part series, which is just mainly labeled Carnage, is worth a ton of money right now, especially because of the fact that Venom Let There Be Carnage was such a success at the box office.
By the way, how did you read Maximum Carnage for us to talk about it today? Do you have the floppies in a box of any of them? Did you pick up a trade paperback?
I actually was able to get all 14 parts. Yeah, I got the entire set for just a little under $50.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I felt that that was, and the funny thing is, I'll tell you a funny story. So you have seen my old comic book collection before it grew into what it is right now. And my goodness, it's a kraken right now. It's crazy. But I actually had one part of Maximum Carnage when I was growing up. It was part 11, and I gave it to somebody. So there were certain things when I started to really get back into collecting, along with trying to complete some stories that I had portions of and wanted to just really get collected completely. I said to myself, you know something, I gotta see if I can hunt down the regular floppies of Maximum Carnage, because this is a story that I should have had in my own personal collection. Yeah. So yes, I managed to find someone who was selling all the parts, you know, all the Spider-Man, Web of Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, the Spider-Man specials, and the Amazing Spider-Man. Yeah, I got them all in one set, and they were all in very good condition. So it was nice to actually have the complete collection. And more importantly, I was really excited to read it as a whole. And yeah, it was just a fun adventure. I had such a great time reading it.
Yeah, I just, for the record, I read it digitally. It was available as part of Prime Reading along with my Amazon Prime account. So I was able to, I didn't even need to purchase one. I would love to get a trade of it. But as Steve knows, we've gone to a couple stores. I think because of the movie, it's been heavily in demand. And the last like 3 months of going to comic shops thinking maybe I'll pick up a physical copy of the trade just so I can have it on my shelf and read it that way, just didn't work out. I looked again today at every place we went.
Like, have you even bothered to go on Amazon? I'm pretty sure it's there.
Oh, I'm sure I could, but just, you know, I like to give my business to the more brick and mortar store when I can. And plus, I could read the story either way. So one day I will luck into seeing it at one of our local comic shops, and I'll just grab it.
So one of the few things that I really like about Maximum Carnage is a very interesting story for Peter, because what's so interesting about Peter in this story is he sort of has a couple of battles that he's trying to fight. He's trying to obviously put Carnage back into prison. He's having a little bit of a rough patch with Mary Jane. And he's also trying too. And to me, it seems really, you see, this is one of the few things that felt a little strange for me about Spider-Man in the story is, I don't know if you felt this, but he feels very reluctant to be actually working with other people in regards to this specific villain. And one of the few things that I know about Spider-Man is that he always embraces working with a team. I mean, look, I never read this issue, but Amazing Spider-Man issue #1 from 1963, the main premise of that book is for him wanting to actually join the Fantastic Four.
Mhm.
So knowing that he always liked to be with teams and he always likes to work with others, it feels very unconventional for me, because here's a time where he really does not want to work with people and he wants to fight this specific villain on his own. It was just a little bit weird for me to get into that headspace about how he was literally pushing people aside, because you would be very surprised with each passing issue, a new person joins the fray on his end. And some of them are very interesting characters.
Yeah, and so I think that the whole thing with the kind of growing team and Spider-Man's reluctance is what Maximum Carnage is a story of the exploration of the Peter Parker character's psyche. And so you have the Carnage family and you have the Venom family. And eventually, you know, Peter kind of has his own group. But, you know, we set up very early in the comic story that, hey, the Avengers are out of town.
Yeah.
This is something that Peter Parker can't do alone, but he's not going to be able to turn to the Avengers. Who can help? And so we get kind of this like anti-hero ragtag group that starts building up around Peter. And it works because it's that conflict of wanting to do what's right and being the not fully formed hero. And we talked about this a little earlier too. So what I mean by that is the Peter Parker character works when he is in development. That version of Spider-Man, and it's why Miles is so popular right now, works when they're discovering who they are. And so not to say that there's an element of Peter that could become Carnage, because that would be going too far. But I think the idea of portraying Carnage and his crew as a family and then mirroring it with every new member of the Carnage family with someone joining up under Venom, who's really leading the charge, is Venom is that more get things done, what if I don't do things for the little guy and mostly care utilitarian perspective on things part of Peter. And Carnage is the what the power is unbridled. And so I think by going through the story in that way and using each issue as a lens of pulling in another character who kind of has those different like moral feelings on how power is used, it makes it a really rewarding read. And then you have on top of that the layer of Peter's literal family, you know, the things that his, you know, father are saying, and the things that Aunt May has to say that contradict that, along with MJ not wanting him to, you know, be out in the world at all for at least half of the story.
Exactly.
It's a very interesting look at zooming in on what Peter's responsibilities are, what that means he needs to do, and how he sees other heroes or anti-heroes or villains operating around him, kind of the path that he could potentially go on. Even though this is an older Peter, we're looking at a married, grown-up Peter Parker,
right?
But he still has these elements of finding who he is, and that's what the story does so masterfully.
And I also think that in development is a very interesting thing, because this is also where the creator of Carnage, Dave Michelini, also came really into the fray in regards to working with these characters, because this was really a big responsibility for him to take on after Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson left. So he had just come off of a very big moment in comics, which is another thing that we actually didn't talk about just yet. Peter at this point in time is also not in a great headspace because he is mourning the loss of Harry Osborn.
That's how the whole thing starts.
Exactly, right? Because I didn't even realize, because here's a fun fact. The very first Spider-Man comic that I ever picked up was Spectacular Spider-Man issue 200, The Death of Harry Osborn. I never would have known that it was going to be one of those extremely iconic books, and it literally spilled right into Maximum Carnage.
Crazy. I did not know that. What a first, okay.
Yeah, that's the very first Spider-Man comic I ever picked up. I thought that I was buying another one, but I realized it was a different one, but then everybody was saying, no, don't be upset. You got to hold on to this one. Yeah. So Dave Michelini along with bringing Carnage into the world, yeah, because I made a little bit of an error. It was not J.M. DeMatteis who created Carnage. It was Dave Michelini. So it's very interesting. So you know how they say with great power comes great responsibility. So this is Dave Michelini feeling that exact same way with all of these great people that are alongside with him putting this Maximum Carnage story together. So maybe that's another main reason as to why Peter is hesitant, because he doesn't want anybody else to get hurt. And he knows that Carnage is a big danger because, again, this is not Venom. Carnage just wants to kill people.
Yeah.
And now he is doing something even worse. He is finding like minds, or creatures with no mind at all that he's easily able to manipulate, because he finds this insane woman named Shriek. He finds Doppelganger, who is literally a beastly version of Spider-Man. He's literally Spider-Man with 8 arms, razor-sharp webs, and doesn't even speak. He's a monster. And then eventually, even the Demo Goblin will join in Carnage's group. And all he wants to do, and he even says this right in the comic, he goes, I just feel like killing people today. And that's insane. And Spider-Man feeling about the burdens, like, especially because Mary Jane doesn't even want him to go out right now as Spider-Man, because she knows he's dealing with so much grief and loss. And that's also why he's pushing some of these heroes that come to help him, because he's in a headspace right now that is very dangerous to be Spider-Man, because he knows that Carnage is dangerous, but he knows that he could possibly lose his own life if he fights Carnage, but he doesn't want anyone else to fight him because he doesn't want to suffer any more loss.
And I will say, so at the beginning of this story, something you said makes me want to address it now. At the beginning of the story, I had some problems with MJ because I kind of thought she was like, I thought she was being portrayed as not even remotely understanding of the problems facing Peter. And it was a little too much. You said you wouldn't be Spider-Man, and I know people are dying right now, but who cares? And I think that was a little bit of a misstep. If there's one thing I didn't like about this comic, I thought the way she was written at the beginning of the arc, and I will say it is redeemed in the kind of like full lens that she got by the end. I mean, she eventually comes around to support Peter, but more than that, by seeing the impact he has on people, the little people, not just the big hero stuff. The thing that does it for her is seeing the individual families that are impacted by what he does, brought her around. And I really liked that because, as I said, I hadn't read this story in a very long time. So admittedly, I was a kid. Most of what I cared about when I read it was the superhero fights. So that wasn't an element of the story that I remembered at all. And so I was ready going into reading that for this to be, oh, is this some sort of like seeding the breakup thing to bring him down so we can have the uncertain Peter again, blah, blah, blah. But I really, really enjoyed by the end the understanding she got, which was a low to the ground understanding of the difference that he makes in individual people's lives. It's not about being the superhero and saving the day. It's about doing what's right and saving the people.
Right. Now, another impressively bold thing that is done in Maximum Carnage, especially considering the beginnings of Venom. Clearly, Venom was created to be a villain. He was basically supposed to be a bigger, stronger, more menacing version of Spider-Man. But the fact that I realized that it happened so quickly, well, maybe Venom doesn't necessarily have to be the bad guy.
Yeah.
So the fact that Venom...
He's funny, by the way. I should admit, Venom's character in this is funny. And we're talking a lot about like the serious themes in it and the action and stuff is explored. We should add, there's a lot of comedic stuff in this.
And it's written well.
Yeah, it's not jarring, it's not out of place. And really, it made me appreciate the recent Venom films.
Right.
Because it's written in that way and that there's so much campy about those movies and it's so strongly there in the Venom character specifically.
Yeah,
in this because I needed to say that.
Yeah, because the first pairing that comes to Spider-Man's aid is Cloak and Dagger. And Cloak and Dagger are a duo that seemed to be extremely popular in the 1980s. I mean, they had another decent role in another crossover event that happened in Marvel at the same time, and that was Inferno, which came about a year or two before. But Cloak and Dagger are still two characters that are hit or miss for me. Like, I still don't really get them. I really don't. I mean, I know they're mutants, but I just don't get them. But after Dagger seems to be killed by Carnage after that first battle that Spider-Man has with them,
puts Cloak firmly in the anti-hero column.
And then Venom, of all people, shows up and says, this is not just your fight, Spider-Man. This is my fight because Carnage is my responsibility. So he says, we will team up for now.
And there's the mirror, right? There's the thing that paints the two families as the parts of Peter's psyche. There's Cloak's feelings of the responsibility of the guilt that he has at the loss of Dagger, that he blames himself for having created the situation that could lead to Dagger being in danger, which is what Peter feels day in and day out about how he chooses to live his life and use his powers. He's afraid that he's putting people at risk. And then you have Venom saying it's so interesting, the word choice, his responsibility to take down Carnage. And that's the thing that Peter hears, because it's all the stuff that's reflecting what we know about the Peter Parker character, and with great power comes great responsibility. And he sees them as, this is a group that he doesn't love teaming up with, but he has a responsibility. He can't let Carnage go. This is the team that he has to be with, and this is the way they look at it. And he's conflicted because he legitimately thinks they're right. Nothing they're saying conflicts with anything I believe. And so their harsh methods and the full with and there's more to join, and we'll talk about them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
But everybody that joins up with Venom, you can definitely see why they're there and why Peter is like, yeah, I'm with them. They are anti-heroes, but this is a part of me too. This has to get solved. You can't let mercy to the criminal negate the moral responsibility you have to their victims. And that's the lens that the anti-heroes come at.
Now, I've got to put something out there, and I really would love your take on this, man. Now, I know one thing, as a comic book reader, I see superheroes go through the ringer all the time. But what is it about Spider-Man? Because I don't know why it is, because I see this all the time in Spider-Man comics. I am pretty sure that when Batman goes out, when the X-Men go out, when Captain America goes out, I know for a solid fact that when they go up against some of their deadliest foes, my God, do they take a pounding. But Spider-Man always seems to be the one of more graphic nature. Like, every single time I read a Spider-Man comic, he talks about, oh my God, I dislocated my shoulder. 3 of my ribs are broken. His costume almost always goes torn up, which is, thank God he knows how to work a sewing machine. But what is it about Spider-Man that seems to always happen? Is it because of the fact that he's this relatable character?
Yeah, definitely. I think he's more of a stand-in for the reader than any other Marvel hero. I think that's what consistently draws people to him. I think it's the same reason that Miles has resonated with people recently, because it takes it back to the roots of the character like that. And so I think that we see these horrible, horrible things happen to Peter. He gets beat up in this comic.
And it's not just in this comic. Like, I just recently read Chip Zdarsky's Devil's Reign.
Yeah.
In issue number 2 of 6, it's all about Spider-Man getting the crap kicked out of him.
Maximum Carnage basically starts with Peter breaking every one of his ribs. And then everything he does in the remaining issues is always through the lens of, I really got to let my ribs heal. I get every single issue. And I know that part of it is, they're writing for the newsstand. They need to make sure that people who pick up an issue in the middle of the run are
dating yourself with the newsstand. But I'm sorry. I love it. I love it, though, because I bought comics off newsstands.
When you buy it off a shelf in a comic store, I refer to those shelves as the stands. Anyway, if you pick up issue 3, it says 3 out of 14, 16, whatever it is at the top. you need to have some context for the reader. So of course he's going to say it, but then when you read the whole thing back to back as a trade paperback, it just reads so brutal because all he can talk about is, oh, Jesus Christ, my ribs.
Yeah.
But you're right, and it's a good thing to point out because it's an intentional thing that multiple writers have known to do instinctively because he is the relatable hero, because he's the human. You don't do it by having him get blown up by a ray gun. You do it by having him get kicked too hard and breaking a bunch of ribs. And that's something that the readers read and they go, oh, yeah, and he's swinging must hurt. And it does. And it's like, how is he going to fight them while he's all beaten up? And then he's in the comic saying, how am I going to fight Carnage when I'm all beaten up? I need these people to help me.
Well, apparently there is an answer out there, and it's also ironically through the help of Venom, because little by little, some of these heroes continue to trickle in to try and assist Spider-Man, because clearly this threat is real, this threat is being known, and Carnage is just not going to stop. And we get the most unlikely bunch of people. I mean, we've already gotten Cloak and Dagger. We've already gotten Venom playing hero. But then we get, and I'm really hoping that I remember all these people, we get Iron Fist. We get Black Cat. We get Deathlock, who was one of the hot items in Marvel Comics at that time.
And we get Morbius, who is a hot item in, oh wait.
I see what you did there. Bad form, Peter, bad form. But I also think that one of the more interesting things was eventually, apparently, one of the Avengers decides to come home.
Yeah,
Captain America shows up.
And I thought that page works so well because the whole thing has been building to the conflict within Peter about how to handle Carnage, and who is it who comes and is the beacon that reminds Peter of who he is? Someone who has done this before and will continue to do it in Peter Parker's life.
Yeah.
Captain America.
And what I also love is until Captain America comes in, you see this ragtag bunch and you see them all butting heads and they're trying to figure out these plans. And again, I think that's what leads to the comedy in this story.
Yeah.
It's fun to watch these heroes squabble.
Yeah.
Because even though they know there's an important thing, you have to remember these are not heroes that strictly go by the book.
Well, I mean, they almost kill Carnage.
Exactly.
And it's only at the last minute does Peter say no.
Well, we'll get into that towards the end, but it's just so interesting because these are a mixture of vigilantes and anti-heroes. They don't go by the book. They don't play well with others. So I think it's very interesting because I think what's really funny, I'm going to say something that may make us laugh right now, especially when you take a look at the heroes and you take a look at the villains, it's literally two marriages.
Yeah.
And every single time they're all by themselves trying to put together plans, they're in couples counseling.
Every time.
It's funny. It's again, that's I think what I love so much about Maximum Carnage. It's not one of those extremely complex crossovers that we got. Because I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Even the complex stories in Marvel and DC, especially in the 80s and 90s, trust me, there are some classics. You will never find anything better. I mean, like, look, if you're frustrated out there in regards to what's going on with X-Men, read everything from Mutant Massacre to Age of Apocalypse, and you will see how it is to write a great X-Men crossover like that. You just see these beautiful stories being composed, and even though some of them are extremely grand, especially when it comes back to Marvel, we think of Infinity War. That's as grand as you can, or even Secret Wars, the original from the 80s. But Carnage, it may be lengthy, but it's fast. It's fun. It's got a ton of action. You can just blow through Maximum Carnage
easily
in about 2 hours.
Easily.
And that's what, and again, because of the fact that it's written like that, it's got tons of rereadability.
And going with that, this is another one of the aspects to go back to the word cinematic. It's very well paced. It's very accessible to the reader. You can go through it, but that's not because you're skimming dialogue and not caring and it's all fluff. It's that it's very real dialogue. It's
and
how
even the quiet
talk.
moments, or the pauses in the action, they're not trailing entirely away from the main focus of the story. You're still locked in to that main plot point. We have to stop Carnage by all means and at all costs.
Everything comes back to that. It's the
Absolutely.
center and the heart of the story, and they never let us get away from it. And that's because it's the driving force of everything. When Peter stops home to see Mary Jane, it's always, I got to get back out there because something's on the news about Carnage. Whenever they actually manage to save someone, Morbius smells blood in the distance, and they got to make sure they follow the trail. You know, it's the driving factor of everything is we need to stop Carnage, and there's no moment of rest. And that's key because Mary Jane wants nothing more than for Peter to have that moment of rest. And he can't give that to her, let alone give that to himself.
But it's also because of the fact that he's once again dealing with the loss of a friend.
Yes.
This is also his distraction.
Yeah.
That's the reason why he does it. You can also see what's also very interesting in this story is you barely see him out of the costume. He's almost always in his costume in this big story.
And here I am calling him Peter. I don't know if I've called him Spider-Man once, but he's in the costume the entire time because that's what the conflict is.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, when you take a look at Spider-Man and in the past, present, and even currently, there's a lot of deep stories that happens to Peter as Peter. But in this story, think about it. When does he go to the Daily Bugle? When does he butt heads with J. Jonah Jameson? Even though J. Jonah Jameson is in there for a little bit, but not too much. But no, this is a strict Spider-Man adventure. This is not a Peter Parker adventure.
But to add some color there, really what I mean is that it's a Spider-Man adventure because the conflict of the story is Peter living up to that and not being able to separate himself from it. And so while he's in the suit the whole time until it rips, when he's in the suit the whole time, he is Peter first in this story, I think. And there's actually, it's interesting. It's easy to read. There's a lot of fun moments. There's a lot of big fights. It's got the team up fun. It's got lots of characters. It's got introductions. Every page, every issue, something's going on. But when it all comes down to it, this is actually a very deep and well thought out story about who Peter is as a character and the conflict he faces. And I think starting it off with, you know, Harry's funeral really helps sell that this is a human story. And you're right to mention a lot of this is Peter using Spider-Man to work through that grief. Right. And we don't go into that very much, but the subtext of the story is loaded with it. And I think this is a great example of something where, you know, like I said, read the story as a kid. You can get so much out of this story as a big Spider-Man fan that you might not think of right off the page when you just see it as Venom's kind of funny, gotta stop Carnage. His main thing is he's, you know, big and destructive and there's no reasoning with him, blah, blah, blah. But that is all in service of a very deep, deep introspective look at the character.
Yeah, and I also really think what's really great about Carnage is, you know, like when you take a look at classic supervillainy, you know, like it's always about like, let me get this big ray gun or let me get this big series of ammunition and bombs. It's like, Carnage doesn't think that way. Yeah. He just wants to go into Times Square and start slashing throats.
He wants to light a fire and lower Eddie onto it. He doesn't want to get a doomsday device.
He doesn't want to go. He wants to go grand with his own two hands. That's what he wants.
Grand with his own two hands is a really good way to put it. Because
I love it.
He isn't looking for the doomsday device. Would he love it to kill everyone on Earth? Probably, but he wants to see it. He wants to be involved. It will take a very long time. There are physical limitations to him doing it. He's a different kind of villain. He's not Galactus.
No.
You know what I mean?
Galactus is great, though.
Yeah. It's completely different. And it works really well for your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man to be put in conflict with a character like that.
So also going on the element of this story being cinematic, I don't know about you, but when I get to the point where Captain America shows up in the last page of his first introduction, I hear the Alan Silvestri score from First Avenger. Like, oh my God, he's here. Yeah. This is it.
It is a big moment.
And he's drawn beautifully in that panel.
And feels earned. Which is interesting in a story that has all the crossovers in every issue with someone new, to the point of it's a who's who of Spider-Man's rogues gallery where you start wondering every issue, who's it going to be this week?
But also, my favorite part about his first appearance in the story is
the halo.
No, it's just he delivers the Captain America line you want to hear from Captain America. I'm not going to quote it word for word, but it was basically like, I heard something was going down in the city. Need some help?
Yeah.
I'm like, that is Captain America to a T. And what's so great is at that point in time in comic books, Captain America wasn't really popular. You know, like, it's sad to say that there were so many heroes outside of Spider-Man, the X-Men, and maybe to a certain degree the Fantastic Four, and maybe the Incredible Hulk. But most characters like Thor and Black Widow and Captain America, and like these characters that like people are literally creaming their pants over right now. There was a time, believe it or not, people, where they were just not popular because they felt dull and old-fashioned.
That's why Marvel got no money for the movie rights back in the day,
which
sounds insane now.
And do yourselves a favor, never watch the 1990 Captain America movie. Never, because you will be so sad that it took such a long time, because you have to remember, Captain America has been in existence since 1942. And it took the comic book world and the film world until 2011 to actually finally give Captain America the respect that he deserves.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and it's interesting. It's a moment in the comic that reads differently now, I think.
I agree.
Because of the I know that he's got history because he's been around since 42, but like there's a moment in pop culture right now centered on the Captain America character, and the MCU is a huge driving factor of that I think makes that moment lands the way that certain parts of Civil War I land, because of the new history we have with Captain America.
Civil War discussions are on the way in this channel, everybody. Trust me, we're going to be doing a Who Wore It Best.
Yeah.
So Captain America comes in, and then things really start to click. You know, Venom's actually listening to other people. Spider-Man's feeling more comfortable working with this ragtag bunch.
Well, it becomes a different group.
Exactly.
Right? We get our third
family.
family.
Because even though Spider-Man is one of those heroes that is trying to find stability in chaos, you know, Captain America is the stability that he needs.
Yes, because Peter is only the head of one family in the comic, and that's Peter's family back home in the apartment.
Correct.
What we have is Venom heading up the ragtag group, we got Carnage heading up the villains, and we have Captain America leading the eventual true hero, quote unquote true hero group, the kind of middle way Spider-Man path in the perfect world. This is my moral compass. This is who I want to be. And so Captain America ends up being a third head of family stand-in for Spider-Man, the actual one that he wants to emulate, the actual one that he wants to be his guiding moral compass.
Right. So the final showdown happens, and let me ask you, what were your overall feelings? Because if I'm going to be honest, I kind of felt that it was a little predictable, because clearly we know what the two weaknesses of the alien symbiote are. So there was no doubt in my mind that they were the things that they were going to be used. I mean, honestly, what I wish we could have seen was Carnage just beaten to a bloody pulp. And Venom would do it. See, that's the thing. Venom would do it,
yeah.
But that's the thing, what happens when Venom teams up with Spider-Man, because Spider-Man is that moral compass that was needed for that exact moment. And he doesn't want Venom to go that far, because even though Peter was not a big fan of Eddie, and Spider-Man and Venom would never truly see eye to eye, deep down inside, one of Spider-Man's greatest qualities is he sees the good in so many. He always believes
the humanity. Even if Carnage is irredeemable, he still sees him as a man.
He always believes that everyone has the ability to redeem themselves. I mean, clearly, if you all saw Spider-Man No Way Home, you literally saw him interacting with these legendary villains of Spider-Man cinema, believing that they could
Could be
all be
redeemed.
saved.
Yep.
It's crazy.
Mhm.
But yeah, so Spider-Man, as always, is the voice of reason. I mean, there are times where he will go to that edge, and there are some times where he literally will go over that edge for a good 5 to 10 minutes.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, he always pulls back because he always remembers with great power comes great responsibility, which is the reason why he let the black costume go, even
Mhm.
though he knew that that costume made him faster, stronger, better.
Mhm.
He wouldn't take it in the end because he knew that what was happening to him was
Not
wrong.
good. Yeah. Yeah. And I will agree that I found the final fight to be anticlimactic, but only in the way that even though Carnage's presence is the driving engine of everything to keep the hunt going, to keep the struggle happening, the main conflict is an internal one in this. And so the fact that the final fight isn't, you know, the memorable, action-packed, like biggest moment in the story doesn't really matter.
No,
that
they
much.
still stick the landing.
They do.
Which
They
is
still do.
something that so many creators, especially with grand stories in comic books today, are still struggling with. And it makes me
All
sick to my
writers.
stomach.
All writers outside of comics have the unique problem of the serialization, soap opera nature of them, that you always need to leave something hanging, something unfinished, something to return to for the character, not unless you kill them. But like you know, so it's understandable why that's the case. But what's resolved in this in a really satisfying way is, I think, his relationship with Mary Jane,
right?
And you know, his decision that he's going to be the hero that he needs to be.
Right.
And that's satisfying. And that's what we want from the Spider-Man character.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess we can really we can start heading towards the end of this discussion, which has been great, by the way. What kind of makes me a little upset is the fact that as we had Carnage pretty much being a staple in the Spider-Man family, you know, we move on forward into the future, and there were more Carnage stories that were eventually created. I personally think that one of the most powerful stories, I don't know if we'll ever talk about it here, but maybe we will one day, was one that showed up in the mid-2000s and 2010s. It was written by Dan Slott when he was writing The Amazing Spider-Man, and he wrote a story called Going Down Swinging, where the Carnage symbiote was discovered by Norman Osborn, and he let the symbiote take him over and combined it with his Green Goblin serum to become the Red Goblin. That, I honestly think, is a very good story. It's something that people have, I think, overlooked unless you are diehard Spider-Man fans. I mean, I didn't know that it existed, and I read it, and it was beautifully done, beautifully done. And not that many people care much for Dan Slott, but I will say that that is probably Dan Slott's best work. Best work. Yeah. But then we moved a little bit forward, and then Donny Cates comes into the world, and he introduces us to the symbiote god named Null, thanks to his Venom run, which people adore. And then we got Absolute Carnage, and then we got Extreme Carnage, and now we have a Carnage solo series reinvigorated thanks to Ram V, which I'm really excited to read. I personally really enjoyed the first issue because we're at a very interesting place with Carnage now, because I didn't read Extreme Carnage, but basically the symbiote finally got rid of Cletus Cassidy, and now it's its own entity. So I'm curious to see what it's going to be like, where Carnage basically has no human mind thinking for him. Like, that's going to be a very interesting story. I'm curious to see where it goes. But the thing is, we got stories like Absolute Carnage, and even though Donny Cates writes good stories and then would move on to the Big King in Black thing, these stories seem to not be able to capture the magic that Maximum Carnage had. I mean, I feel that there was a little bit more to some of these stories because there were so many other elements at play, looking toward, I guess it's just because of the fact that a story like Absolute Carnage, they were saying like, okay, this is a great story, but trust me, this is just the start of something. There's going to be something bigger and better down the line. I think that's the weakness. The problem is the fact that nowadays, when it comes to these big stories, they don't want to make these stories truly stand out on their own. I think it's also because of how the movies are these days. You know, like you get one movie and then you get that post-credit scene, and then you know that there's something bigger and better coming down the line.
Yeah.
With a story like Maximum Carnage, you had a great entertaining story, and after you got to that last chapter, you could have easily said, I want to continue reading Spider-Man, or you know what? I don't need to read any more Spider-Man right now. Maybe I'll wait for another big story, or maybe I'll just look at a different comic book elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it goes back to what we were saying about how easy it is to read. It's self-contained, it's easy to read, it's complete, lets you see a bunch of characters that you like. I think it's really great. And it's also an example of something that I'm not sure how often we'll see that kind of story told again. It's not how we tend to do events these days. This is an event, but it's a Spider-Man event. It's told across a bunch of Spider-Man books. There were just so many of them at the time.
Well, that's the thing. When it comes to crossovers, especially crossovers that you saw in the 90s, like they really tried to make them grand, but at the same time, they tried to make them self-contained. Like, they didn't necessarily need to involve the entirety of the Marvel Universe.
No.
Now, granted, a little later down the line in the 90s, they tried to do that for the purposes of trying to invigorate books that weren't selling. And that was Onslaught, which unfortunately for me was an absolute disaster. And it's so upsetting because it was a story that could have been something truly special. But maybe it was just because there were just too many cooks in the kitchen, or maybe there were just too many things at stake. I don't know if we'll ever know unless we literally find these writers and just sit down with them and have a chat saying, what were you doing? What was going on in your mind? But you're absolutely right. There are events that were taking place, but today everyone seems to feel that every one of these events needs to have everything at stake. And I just
gotta be Secret Wars 2016 every single time.
And unfortunately, there's way too many of them. Like literally, they're like, the event of the summer is coming. And that's 3 times after they had 3 events that were supposed to be the event of the summer that have already happened. Now here's the next one. You know, like it's I think it's just getting too much too fast. And I really feel that even though there are a lot of people who critique the 90s world of comic books, I think people really need to go back to those points, because it really was the 80s and the 90s when the crossover events were really starting to be turned into something stable and be its own big entity. So I really feel that some creators really need to go back to those roots. Like, what was it that made those classic events so special? Like, what made Maximum Carnage so great? What made Executioner's Song so great? What made Infinity Gauntlet so great, you know?
Well, Maximum Carnage, I think, sits more alongside kind of the limited series stories than it does crossover event stories. It's an event in the loosest sense of the term, in that it crossed multiple books and there were a lot of characters. But it's a Spider-Man story, and it's told through Spider-Man books. It reads more in like the family of, I mean, we had a discussion about Long Halloween on this channel, right? You know, about 12 issues of focusing on one story, the one character. It reads more like something like that.
I agree.
Than it does something like Secret Wars 2016.
And I think that that's the reason why these stories are so impactful, and why people will take those stories over others like Secret Wars 2016, like you keep saying, which apparently I think is going to be a story that I never read.
I mean, for the record, I've read it, I actually enjoy it. It's just, it's trying to think of biggest universe changing, absolutely every character, everything is different now, the stakes couldn't possibly be higher, blah, blah,
Crisis
blah, blah,
on
blah.
Infinite Earths.
Yeah, every event tries to be that, or like tries to, you know, falls into that. Anyway, which is why I say Maximum Carnage, while it's a quote unquote event, it's got more in common with the pedigree of like a lengthy limited run series than it does an event.
So yeah, I recommend Maximum Carnage. If you just want to read an amazing Spider-Man story, that's definitely what you need to see. You're going to get a lot of great characters, you're going to get a lot of great moments, and you're just going to have a fun time, because that's at the end of the day what we as comic readers want. We just want to have fun.
I think you're never going to see Maximum Carnage in like a top 10 list of greatest Spider-Man stories ever told. But I think I think that's very limited to what we think of as Spider-Man stories or like impressive issues or big moments. And really, things with the Spider-Man character linger with us because he's so embedded into pop culture that, like, you can do a movie like No Way Home that is self-referential to other movie series and trust that the audience knows it even beyond the MCU focused audience. That's the kind of universe we live in with Spider-Man. So we know big moments, like you said before, the death of Gwen Stacy. But Maximum Carnage, I think, is a Spider-Man story about Spider-Man, the Spider-Man character, getting to see what he does outside of these big moments that get referenced in every refresh of the character in animation, in movies. This is using the character in a comic to tell a comic book story and doing some really cool stuff for it. That is a fun read. I recommend Maximum Carnage fully. There are better Spider-Man stories. There are way more worse Spider-Man stories than Maximum Carnage. If you're at all a comic fan, if you're at all interested in Spider-Man or already love him, you got to read Maximum Carnage. You'll enjoy Maximum Carnage.
And if you want to read some really interesting Carnage stuff right now, the brand new Carnage solo series, I've already read the first issue, which is also written by Ram V. I say Ram V is a great artist, and he's a great writer to start reading because I find him very interesting in regard to how he writes things, and I am very curious to see how the first story arc in this Carnage solo series is going to go. And I also want to recommend a brand new mini series because after this, because of the impact that this story had on Venom, it would go on that Venom would actually get his own solo series called Venom Lethal Protector, written by David Michelinie, who created Carnage. It was a pretty well responded to fan favorite series, so much in fact that Dave Michelinie just started writing a 5-issue miniseries called Venom Lethal Protector, which is supposed to be a story about Venom in the 90s. And I will say firsthand, I've already read the first issue, and it's fun.
Great.
I highly recommend that. So everybody, thank you so much for watching. This was a fantastic conversation, Andy. We will be back very soon with our character profile episode on Spider-Man because we still have to continue celebrating the 60th anniversary of this incredible character. But in the meantime, everybody, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one.
See you guys. A lot of fun.